Welcome to the dark side of true stories, where every whisper hides a secret and every silence has a scream. Subscribe now because here, the fear is real, and you never know who's listening. The wind howled through the narrow gaps in the farmhouse walls, carrying with it the heavy scent of wet earth and decay. It was a familiar smell, one that had seeped into my clothes and skin ever since I took the job. I had always been good with animals, so when the opportunity came to work on a farm, I took it without hesitation. I thought I'd be able to save up some money, keep things simple, and then leave when I had enough. But as the days stretched into weeks, something shifted, something in the land, something in the air, and I found myself wishing I had never set foot on that farm. It started with little things. The shadows seemed too long, stretching further than they should have, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The barn creaked and groaned at night as if it was alive, whispering secrets to anyone who was foolish enough to listen. The horses, usually calm, began to act restless. They pawed at the ground, their eyes wide and frantic, as if they could see something I couldn't. But it wasn't until the first night shift that I realized just how far I had crossed into something I couldn't escape. I had been assigned the graveyard shift in the barn, something I was initially okay with. I figured the isolation would give me time to think, to reflect on what had brought me here in the first place. The truth was, I was running from something. A failed relationship, a mounting pile of bills, and the constant pressure of life back in the city had pushed me to leave it all behind. The farm, with its promise of simplicity, was supposed to be a refuge, but now, standing in the dark barn as the wind screamed outside, I wondered if I had made a mistake. The first few hours were typical, feeding the animals, checking on the cows and goats, cleaning up after the pigs. But as the night deepened, I began to feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Every little sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from a leaky pipe, the rustle of hay as the horses shifted in their stalls, and then the scratching. It started in the back corner of the barn. At first I thought it was just a rat, or maybe the wind pushing against the old wood. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way out from the darkness. I set down the bucket of feed and turned toward the sound, my heart already racing. The barn was dimly lit, the flickering lantern casting long, wavering shadows across the haystacks and animal pens. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. Now something was moving. I took a step forward, trying to steady my breath, and that's when I saw it. In the farthest corner of the barn, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light, a figure crouched low to the ground. It was hard to make out at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see its shape clearly. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too gaunt, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched tight over its bones like an old leather glove. But the worst part, its eyes, hollow, empty, the kind of eyes you see in nightmares, the kind that make your skin crawl, like there's nothing behind them, only darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, unable to move. It slowly turned its head toward me, its neck creaking like an old tree. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The creature's lips parted, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, as if they had been filed down over time. A cold, whispering laugh filled the air, vibrating the walls of the barn. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could barely think. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. And then the barn door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I spun around, but there was no one there. The door was locked, the bolt shot into place from the inside. The thing, it wasn't a thing. It was something worse. Slowly rose to its full height, its limbs unfolding like a spider's. It took one deliberate step toward me, its long fingers dragging across the floor, leaving behind a trail of something black, something viscous that I couldn't quite identify. The sound of the horses, the nervous snorts and the pounding of hooves against the wood, grew louder. I could hear them kicking at their stalls, as if they too knew what was about to happen. The creature smiled, if you could call it that, tanned. The corners of its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. "Leave," it whispered, its voice deeper now, almost familiar. It was like hearing my own thoughts spoken back to me, but twisted, distorted. "Leave, or be like them." Before I could react, the barn door burst open and the creature disappeared into the shadows, vanishing in an instant like it had never been there. I stood there, panting, staring into the dark where it had been, too terrified to move. My mind was reeling, but I knew I couldn't stay in the barn any longer. I ran, stumbling toward the house, barely making it inside before the door slammed shut behind me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with what I had just seen. There was no way it was real. No way something like that could exist. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. The next morning I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, a trick of the night. But the barn, there was something wrong with the barn. It felt different. The air was thick, charged, as if something was waiting there, something watching. The other farmhands had gone silent when I mentioned the night shift. No one spoke much to me after that. There were whispers, though, behind closed doors. People avoided me, avoided the barn, and even the animals seemed skittish around me, eyes wide, filled with a silent understanding that I didn't share. I spent the next few days trying to ignore what I had seen, but the whispers never stopped. At night, I could hear it scratching at the walls of my mind, demanding that I go back, that I face it again. I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the nightmare I had walked into. The animals grew more restless as each night passed. The whispers in the barn grew louder, and the creature, I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't breathe. Every moment spent on that farm felt like a slow descent into madness. I had to leave, but as I stood at the door, suitcase in hand, ready to flee, something stopped me. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the wind outside howled louder than I had ever heard it. The barn door creaked in the distance, and I knew without a doubt that it was waiting for me. I couldn't escape. I turned back to the house, and the world outside seemed to fade away. I felt a hand, cold and invisible, reach inside me, pulling me back into the dark. Something in me snapped. Something broke. And as the sun set on that farm, I knew one thing for sure. I would never leave. Not alive. Not if the land had its way. Not if the thing in the barn had decided I was next. And that's when I understood. I'd rather die than work that farm at night again. I should have known something was wrong when the ad said farmhand wanted, no experience necessary. But at the time I was desperate, and the promise of a steady paycheck sounded like the lifeline I needed. I'd been bouncing from job to job after my brother's death, unable to keep any position for more than a few months. The loss weighed heavily on me, and every day felt like trudging through a haze. But this farm in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, seemed like the kind of isolation I craved. The farm was called Black Hollow, a name I never thought much about. I arrived late in the evening, greeted by a man who barely looked me in the eye as he handed me a set of keys. "Work starts at sunrise," he said gruffly before disappearing into the shadows of the barn. That first night on the farm was unsettling. The house I was assigned to was small and modest, with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The walls cracked and faded, felt like they had their own stories to tell. I brushed it off as just my nerves getting the better of me. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and the air smelled of earth and something darker, something rotting beneath the surface. I tried to sleep, but the night seemed to stretch on forever. The silence was oppressive. No crickets, no owls, just the sound of wind slapping against the barn doors. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke with a start, my heart pounding. There was something, a low scraping sound from outside, like metal dragging against stone. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But something in my gut told me otherwise. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. It felt as if something was circling the house, sniffing at the walls. I jumped out of bed, grabbing a flashlight and creeping to the window. Nothing, but as I turned to leave, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, tall, thin, and unnaturally straight. Its limbs were too long, too stiff, as if it had been put together wrong. The figure had no face, just a dark, featureless void where its head should have been. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was gone in the blink of an eye, swallowed by the darkness of the fields beyond the house. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house another night. The next morning, I told the man in charge, Jake, about what had happened. He just chuckled. "You get used to the wind out here. It plays tricks on your mind." But his eyes didn't match the words. They darted nervously, like he was hiding something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't being told the truth. The days on the farm passed slowly. I did my work feeding the animals, cleaning the pens, moving hay bales, but the dread never left me. The silence at night became worse, the air thicker, suffocating. It felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Then came the night shift. Jake asked me to cover the barn after dark. It was a task no one ever wanted, but I needed the money, and honestly, I didn't know what else to do. As I stood in the dimly lit barn, the only sounds were the soft shuffle of hooves, the occasional moo from the cows, and the distant rustle of the trees outside. But something felt wrong. The barn was cold, colder than it had any right to be. The wind outside had stopped, and the stillness was unbearable. I looked around, checking on the animals. That's when I saw it, a horse, its body twisted and contorted, its skin pulled tight over its bones, like someone had peeled it off and put it back on wrong. Its eyes, those wide, horrified eyes, stared back at me, empty and lifeless. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the shape moving in the shadows of the barn. I turned toward it, and my flashlight flickered, casting long, trembling beams across the dark corners. There, just out of sight, was another figure, tall, thin, with long, spindly arms. It was crouched, its back bent at an impossible angle. The figure's skin was stretched tight, the seams along its limbs gaping as if something inside was trying to break free. It was wearing something that looked human, a torn and tattered body, skin and flesh stretched over its skeletal frame. A man's face, or what was left of it, hung loosely from its head, stitched together like a ragged mask. The eyes behind the mask glowed faintly, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move, but my mind screamed at me to run. But before I could, the thing turned its head slowly, its mouth opening wide, impossibly wide. It let out a sound, a noise like dry paper tearing before it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice wasn't its own. It was a collection of voices, distorted and layered over one another, making my skin crawl. I turned to run, but the barn door slammed shut, and I heard the unmistakable sound of hooves behind me, the heavy thud of something following, something that moved too fast, too silently. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I had to get away. The wind picked up again, rattling the barn, pushing me forward as I stumbled through the darkness. My flashlight flickered, revealing glimpses of the barn's interior, shadows moving in ways that were wrong, as if the barn itself was alive. I reached the door, fumbling for the latch. Behind me, I heard the sound of hooves growing louder, closer, and then, just as I thought I'd escape, the barn door opened, revealing nothing but darkness. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the cold, suffocating air and the silence of the field. It was then that I understood. The farm was never meant to keep me. It was meant to take me, to make me one of them, to wear me, to wear my face, my flesh, just like it had done to everything else before me. I couldn't leave, not now. The farm had already claimed me, just like it had claimed the others. The thing in the barn wasn't just a creature, it was the farm itself, alive, hungry, and waiting for me to become part of it. And as I stood in the doorway, my hands shaking, I realized I had become its next victim. I'd rather die than work that farm at night again, but I didn't have a choice. I never had. I came to the farm on a whim, thinking it would be the fresh start I needed. After everything that had happened in the city, loss, betrayal, the relentless grind, I needed a place to reset. The ad had seemed simple enough. Farmhand wanted, room and board provided, no experience necessary. I didn't care much about the details. The promise of a place where I could breathe, work hard, and forget the rest of the world was enough. The farm was called Wilkins Hollow, and it was about 2 hours outside of town. The house was isolated, surrounded by miles of fields and overgrown woods that seemed to stretch on forever. It looked like a place frozen in time, stuck between the 1800s and the present. The barn was old, the wood faded from years of sun and rain, the fields looked untouched by modern machinery, and the air smelled of earth, hay, and something that reminded me of dampness I couldn't quite place. The first night was uneventful. The owner, Calvin, was a quiet man who didn't say much. He seemed distracted, and when I asked him about the farm's history, he just brushed it off with a short, "Family's been here for generations." The rest of the workers were scattered, some working the fields during the day, some taking care of the animals at night. It was lonely, but I liked that. No one asked too many questions, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. But then came the nights. At first it was subtle. The barn creaked, the animals were restless, but nothing that would have made anyone nervous. The wind would howl through the cracks in the windows, making the house feel cold even when the heater was on full blast. But as the days wore on, something changed. The animals grew more agitated, especially the horses. Their nervous eyes followed me whenever I passed, and sometimes I'd hear them snorting, like they were trying to warn me about something. It was the night shift that did it. Calvin asked me to cover the barn that night. I had been working the farm for about a week, and although I didn't mind the extra hours, there was something unsettling about being alone in that barn. It was too quiet, too far from anything. I took a lantern and headed out into the barn as the sun dipped behind the horizon, leaving everything drenched in an eerie twilight. The air inside the barn was thick, the smell of hay mingling with something else, something metallic, like rust, or maybe blood. I chalked it up to the old building, but the feeling didn't sit right with me. The animals, who usually gave me no trouble, were huddled in the back corners of their pens. Their eyes glinted in the lantern light, their bodies tense, as if they were watching something. Then, I heard it, a faint scratching sound from one of the farthest corners of the barn. I stood frozen, the hair on my neck standing up. I looked toward the corner, my heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the dark shadows stretching from the barn walls. The scratching continued, growing louder. It was coming from inside the walls now, as though something was trying to claw its way out. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, my breath shallow and quick. Every instinct I had screamed for me to leave, but something else kept me rooted to the spot. And then, it happened. The sound stopped. The barn fell into a deep, suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, when I heard something movement, a rustling, coming from the back of the barn. My heart lurched in my chest. I grabbed the lantern and moved toward the sound, every step heavy and slow. When I rounded the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, crouched low on the ground, its body twisting unnaturally as it moved, as if it were too long for its own frame. Its skin, if you could call it, that was stretched thin, taut over its bones like an old, weathered leather jacket. But it wasn't the skin that made me freeze, it was the face, or rather, the lack of one. There was no face, just a patchwork of skin and jagged seams where eyes should have been. The mouth was nothing but a jagged slit that seemed to stretch too wide, revealing teeth far too sharp, too long. The thing, if you could even call it that, was standing still, as if it had been waiting for me to approach. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't obey. It turned slowly to face me, its head jerking unnaturally to the side. The skin on its neck stretched with the movement, and I could hear it tearing, like fabric being ripped. The sound that came from it was guttural, a low rasp that didn't seem to belong to any living creature. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed, its voice distorted, layered with 1,000 other voices, some familiar, some not. My feet finally moved, and I bolted toward the door, tripping over the hay scattered across the floor. I didn't look back, not even when I reached the barn door and slammed it shut behind me. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding, my legs aching from the terror that was gnawing at me. The cold air bit at my skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep within me. I locked myself in the house, hands shaking as I tried to steady my breath. But the thing in the barn wasn't gone. It was still there, watching, waiting. I could feel its presence. It wasn't just the barn. It wasn't just the animals. It was the land itself. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The thought of going back to the barn made my stomach churn, but I had to. The work had to be done, and Calvin wouldn't understand. No one would. The next night, I stood at the barn door, my lantern held tightly in my hands. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but as soon as I stepped inside, I could feel it, the oppressive weight of something watching me. The scratching started again, coming from the same place. I moved toward it, my hands trembling, but this time, the creature wasn't alone. It had brought others with it. Faces, no, masks all stitched together, all wearing the same hollow, empty expression. And I understood then, the farm wasn't just a place, it was a trap. The land had taken them all, the workers, the animals, even the ones who had come before me. They were now part of it, wearing masks made of skin, stitched together by something that lived in the soil itself. I was never meant to leave. I'd rather die than work that farm at night again, but I had no choice. The land was already taking me. The air grew thicker, the barn grew darker, and in the end, I became another face in its endless collection. And now, I waiting for someone else to come to the farm, to wear my face. I should have known something was wrong when I first arrived at Hollow Creek Farm, but the desperation in my chest was louder than the warning bells going off in my head. The ad seemed perfect: farmhand needed for the summer, a place to stay, meals provided, good pay. I'd been running from my own failures, drowning in a sea of bad decisions, and the idea of escaping to a quiet farm for a few months felt like the answer to everything. What I didn't know, what no one could have told me, was that the farm itself was the one thing I was running toward, and it was NT planning on letting me leave. When I pulled up to the farm, it looked picturesque in the light of late afternoon. The house, a sprawling old farmhouse with peeling white paint, sat back from the road, surrounded by overgrown grass and towering trees. It felt like something out of a history book. The barn next to it, dark and imposing, had a heavy wooden door that seemed to groan whenever the wind hit it. There was an old tractor in the yard, rusted and abandoned, a perfect snapshot of rural life, or so I thought. The man who greeted me, Jonas, was a grizzled middle-aged guy with rough hands and deep lines etched into his face. He barely smiled and said little, just handed me a set of keys to the small cabin I'd be staying in. "Work starts tomorrow," he said in a gravelly voice, his eyes darting nervously toward the barn. "Don't stay out too late. The farm doesn't like visitors at night." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his face didn't change. "Of course," I said, taking the keys and the warning with a grain of salt. The first day passed without incident. The work was grueling, but that was fine. It felt like hard, honest labor, and I welcomed the distraction. But as the sun began to set, something in the air shifted. The farm felt different. It felt alive, but not in a way that made me feel comfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, and it was empty. The normal kind of loneliness you'd expect on a farm like this. This was something else. A presence. When I finished my shift, Jonas had already gone inside the main house, leaving me to lock up the barn and head back to my cabin. I noticed something strange as I walked back, movement in the woods surrounding the farm. Something dark, shifting between the trees, always just out of sight. I froze for a second, heart hammering in my chest. It was probably an animal, I told myself, a deer or a coyote. But that feeling, that heavy gnawing sensation, lingered. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The wind outside howled against the walls, but the barn door seemed to creak and groan with each gust, as though something inside was trying to escape. The air in the room felt thick, like I was breathing in more than just dust. It was suffocating. And then, I heard it. A tapping sound, slow at first, like someone knocking on a door, but it was coming from the cabin's walls. My pulse quickened. It's just the house settling. I tried to convince myself, but the tapping grew louder, quicker. And then, it sounded like something was scratching, claws dragging across wood. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled outside, shining it along the edges of the cabin. There was nothing there, just the dark stretch of trees beyond the yard, the barn standing silent in the distance. I returned to my cabin, shaking, telling myself that it was nothing, just nerves. But as I lay back down, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The next day, I went to Jonas to ask about the strange noises. He seemed uncomfortable, glancing quickly over his shoulder before answering. "Don't worry about it, just the wind. This place does strange things to people." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I didn't press him further. I had work to do, and the unease was something I would have to learn to live with if I was going to stick it out here. That night, though, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The barn had always given off a strange vibe, quiet, oppressive, but tonight something felt different. The wind was still, the air heavy, but it was the barn that seemed to be calling to me, drawing me toward it like a magnet. The animals were eerily quiet inside. The cows stood in their stalls, their eyes wide, unblinking. Even the horses didn't make a sound. As I approached the barn door, I could see something move inside, a shadow flitting across the dusty floor. I stood at the edge, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. The moment I touched the handle, a low growl came from inside, followed by the sound of hooves pounding the ground. The barn door swung open with a sudden force, as though it had been waiting for me to unlock it. I stepped inside, my heart in my throat. The barn was darker than usual, the shadows thicker. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but the sound of something scraping along the floor grew louder. I flashed a light toward the far corner, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, hunched in the shadows. It was covered in what looked like skin, patches of skin, sewn together haphazardly, draped over its limbs and torso. It wore a face that was nothing more than a mask, a patchwork of human skin, eyes empty and hollow, staring right at me. I froze, unable to move. The creature, if it even was a creature, tilted its head, the skin on its neck stretching unnaturally as it did. I could hear the sound of its breath, ragged, like a wheeze that didn't belong in this world. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice a low rasp, muffled, but clear enough to send a chill through my spine. Before I could react, it lunged. I ran, stumbling over the scattered hay and broken planks, my flashlight falling to the ground with a clatter. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could hear it, moving behind me, following me. The barn door slammed shut behind me as I stumbled outside, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, but the horror of what I had seen was clear. I rushed back to the main house, banging on the door, but Jonas didn't answer. No one answered. The house was empty. The farm was empty, except for the thing I had seen. And the thing that had seen me. It wasn't just the barn, it wasn't just the land. It was the whole farm. Hollow Creek wasn't a farm at all. It was a graveyard, a place where something other had been buried long ago. Something that had been waiting, watching, hungry for those who came to work its fields. I wanted to leave, but as the sun set the next day, the barn door creaked open again. I could hear something moving in the distance, scraping at the ground. It was coming for me. I would have rather died than work that farm again. But now I know, I never really left. And soon someone else will arrive, someone who will take my place. I took the job at the farm because I had nowhere else to go. My life had become a series of dead ends, relationships crumbling, bills piling up, and a sense of failure gnawing at me from the inside out. When I saw the ad, I didn't hesitate. Farmhand wanted, room and board included. Experience not necessary. It seemed like the perfect escape, a fresh start. Just me, the land, and whatever hard work I could do to pay my way. The ad promised peace, simplicity, but it didn't tell me the truth I'd only learn when it was far too late. The farm was called Black Hollow, nestled deep in the countryside, miles away from the nearest town. When I arrived, the first thing that hit me was the smell, the stale, rotting air of something forgotten. The house sat crooked and weathered, its paint peeling from years of neglect. The barn stood behind it, dark and looming, the wood darkened by years of rain and sun. The land surrounding the farm was vast, stretching out in all directions. A quiet emptiness that made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt before. The owner, a man named Caleb, was an older man, his eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in decades. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was only to give me instructions. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was holding something back. The farm had been in his family for generations, he said, but he mentioned what had happened to the previous workers or why they never stayed long. "You'll sleep in the cabin next to the barn," Caleb told me, his voice gruff. "There's a cot in there. Get yourself settled, but don't wander too far at night. The land's strange after dark, always has been." I nodded, thinking it was just another odd remark from an eccentric old man. I set to work the next morning, feeding the animals, mending fences, and tending to the crops. The farm was big, and the work was exhausting, but it gave me a purpose, something to distract from the noise in my head. I spent the days outside in the open air, where it felt like I could breathe again. But when night fell, the atmosphere would change. The wind seemed to pick up with a certain weight, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The barn loomed in the distance, and I'd feel its presence in a way I couldn't explain, like it was watching me, waiting. It was the first night I worked in the barn when I realized something was wrong. The horses were already inside, their large, nervous eyes tracking me as I entered. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a strange smell like damp earth and something else, something metallic. I went to check the stalls, but as I moved deeper into the barn, I heard it, a low, scraping sound, like claws dragging across the floor. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each step I took toward the back corner. I stopped. The thing moved toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it was learning how to walk all over again. A low growl escaped from the back of its throat, a sound that didn't belong to anything living. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place as it got closer, dragging its broken body across the barn floor. Its hand its claw reached out, the skin too thin and pale, fingers twisted and sharp. "Leave," it whispered, its voice a raspy, guttural hiss. but it wasn't its own voice. It was layered, a cacophony of whispers, a chorus of voices speaking over one another, none of them fully human. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even scream. I just turned and ran, sprinting through the barn and out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't dare. The wind howled around me as I ran toward the house, my breath ragged, my legs burning with the terror that gripped me. I locked myself in the cabin, my chest heaving with each breath, my mind racing. What had I seen? What the hell was that thing? The next morning, I told Caleb about what had happened. He listened, his face stoic, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew he had known all along. "It's the land," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "It takes what it wants. And once it gets its hands on you, it doesn't let go." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he just shook his head. "Don't go out there at night again. You've seen enough." But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing in the barn, about what Caleb wasn't saying. I needed answers, needed to understand what I had walked into. I started asking around, trying to find out about the farm's history, but no one would talk to me. People in town avoided me, their eyes darting nervously whenever I brought up the farm. It wasn't until the old bartender at the local inn leaned in close and whispered, "You don't stay at Black Hollow, boy. People don't last. They never stay long enough to talk about it." But by then I was too deep. I couldn't leave. The land had already claimed me. That night, the creature came again, its shadow stretching across the barn, just out of reach of the lantern's light. This time, it wasn't just one. There were more figures standing still in the darkness, faces like masks, bodies twisted and wrong. They were waiting for me, waiting for the moment I would be too tired, too desperate to fight back. I tried to leave, packed my things, ready to escape the madness, but the road outside the farm was blocked by the very thing I had feared. A figure stood at the edge of the field, its face now a grotesque imitation of mine. It was wearing my skin, my face, its hollow eyes staring back at me. "I told you," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of all the voices that had come before me. "You shouldn't have stayed. I had tried to leave, but I never will. I'd rather die than work that farm again, but the farm doesn't let you go. The land claims you, and you become one of them. Another face, another mask, stitched together into the land's grotesque tapestry. And now I wait, waiting for someone else to come, to wear my face." I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.